This podcast is brought to you by the American Enterprise Institute.
If you like what you hear, please subscribe, rate, review, and share.
Thanks for listening. Here's our show.
What the hell is going on?
What's really going on?
We said, what the hell happened? You don't have to know what the hell is on it.
They see what's going on.
I don't know what's going on. What is going on? We must find out what is going on.
Hi, I'm Danielle Pletka.
I'm Mark Thiessen.
Welcome to our podcast, What the Hell is Going On? Mark, what the hell's going on today?
What the hell is going on is that we finally have the Harvard Antisemitism report has come out, and it is 300 pages. It is stunning. We don't expect all of you to read it, so we got somebody who has read it. We've got Maya Sulkin from the Free Press, who has read the entire report, has dug through it, and is coming on to share with us the findings, which I will suggest that even you will be stunned by some of the things that this report uncovered.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely unbelievable. And I will say it has been remarkable to me how well orchestrated the quote-unquote backlash against the Trump administration's crackdown on anti-Semitism on campus has been. Because the narrative that is first and foremost, it's in the New York Times today, but it's pretty much everywhere all the time, is that the Trump administration is, and I asked Maya about this as well, quote, weaponizing anti-Semitism. I wrote about this on the Substack a couple of weeks ago, but the question that I asked at the end of it is the one that for me remains the most important, which is if any other group were going after systematic discrimination, intimidation, violence, hostile work and academic atmospheres, and violations of the Civil Rights Act, if it were Black people, if it were Asian people, if it were Hispanic, would anybody ever say, and have you ever heard the word used, you are weaponizing anti-Black behavior to benefit Black
racism.
people? You are weaponizing Jim Crow. You never would hear it. It's only Jews who are not allowed to defend themselves. It's the analog to Israel. Only Israel is not allowed to defend itself. And the fact that this is now being orchestrated, and I suspect still paid for by the far left and by their backers in the Middle East, is just unbelievable.
Yes, no, exactly. If you took this entire 300-page report and deleted the word Jew or Jewish and inserted the word Black or African American, and you read this, the left would be setting their hair on fire about
and rightly
about
so.
what is
and
happening
rightly
here.
So. Right?
Yes,
we abhor
exactly.
discrimination.
But I just want to
country.
share one story here because that is in our research, because I just found this remarkable. This is from the introduction of the report. Each year, a program at Harvard hosts a forum in which student fellowship recipients are invited to share their stories in short speeches. In 2023, one child who is a grandchild of Holocaust survivors who inspired their career goals gave prepared remarks where they shared how the student's grandfather survived the Holocaust by migrating to the then British Mandated Palestine and ultimately helped tens of thousands of others find refuge in the territory that's now the modern part of the modern state of Israel. The student recounted what happened next. The student directors of the conference pulled me aside and said I cannot mention my grandfather's rescue missions in my speech because his rescue missions involve Israel. Nowhere in my speech did the current war or Zionism appear. It was strictly about the Holocaust. The student organizer said, my family's Holocaust narrative is not tasteful. And I asked, what's not tasteful? And one of the students laughed in my face and said, oh my God. This is what
unbelievable
people are experiencing on campus. And sometimes it's overt like this. Sometimes it's subtle. Sometimes it's just a conversation in a classroom where some anti-Semitic comment is made. Sometimes it's being shouted at. Sometimes it's a protest where they're not able to get to their classes or the class was canceled in solidarity with the protesters. But there is this deep-seated anti-Semitism that has permeated the university. And I'm sorry, but I'm with the Trump administration. Rip it out root and branch, and the only way to do it is by threatening the only thing they care about, which is money.
No, that's right. I mean, that's exactly right. And, while we were talking to Maya, Ben sent me the data. Jewish undergraduate enrollment at Harvard University has gone from 25% to 5% in less than 20 years.
That's
This is a
amazing.
larger decline than after Harvard openly instituted a Jewish quota in the 1920s. These people, these people have the heart and soul of the National Socialist movement at their backs. It is absolutely unbelievable. Trump gets called, well, by his vice president, to be fair, Hitler. But in fact, it is these elite universities that are emulating the Nuremberg laws, that are emulating the kind of Jew hatred that we saw in the 1920s and 30s. It's unbelievable.
And I will tell you, everybody should take a moment to read the letter that the Trump administration sent to Harvard about what its demands were, because I read through these and they're completely reasonable. Every single one of them. It's not like they're asking for anything that's outrageous. They're asking for merit-based admissions, elimination of DEI. This is where DEI is really at the root of all of this, because this is not just anti-Semitism, it's anti-Americanism, it's anti-Western ideology that's at the root of this. They're trying to get at the root and branch of what is causing all this, which is not just anti-Semitism, it's anti-Western ideology, it's neo-Marxism in the form of DEI and critical theory, which basically teaches that the world is divided into an oppressor class and the oppressed class. In the old Marxism, the oppressor class was literally an economic class. Now it's race. And so now the Jews are the oppressor class suddenly, and the Palestinians are the oppressed. And so the oppressed can do anything they want in the battle against the oppressor class. And so you can't just get rid of the anti-Semitism, because the anti-Semitism is the symptom of the larger problem, which is that this deeply Marxist, anti-American, anti-Western ideology has taken root, and you got to rip it out root and branch, or else the anti-Semitism is never going to go away.
No, it 100%. It 100% the truth that and this is what I have said about this anti-Semitism that is so pervasive. You can't stop people from hating Jews, but you can so stigmatize Jew hatred. It's just like racism. You can't stop people from hating minorities, but you can so stigmatize it that they will never advertise or act on their views. That is what needs to happen with anti-Semitism. Hey, anyway, we have more from Maya about this coming up. Maya Sulkin is a reporter at the Free Press. Before that, Maya was chief of staff of the FP, and she began, as she told us, as an intern there in 2021 while a student at, wait for it, Columbia University.
So she knows of what she speaks. Here's our interview. Well, Maya, welcome to the podcast.
I'm so happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Well, we're so happy to have you. And so you read this anti-Semitism report so that the rest of the world doesn't have to. Give us the findings. What did you discover?
Yeah, I mean, to anyone who's been paying a little bit of attention, the 311-page report was actually really not shocking, but it was, of course, pretty hard to digest all of that information in one sitting. And so, I mean, it kind of shows what students there already knew to be true, which was that the norm for Jewish students and professors was, one, censorship, but also what I found to be perhaps even more alarming was this kind of social ostracization. So, I mean, the numbers show that 73% of Jewish students expressed discomfort sharing their political opinions. 75% believe there is academic or professional penalty for expressing their views at Harvard. But then there were really harrowing stories about students who just lost their friends. I mean, not even for saying anything, outwardly in defense of Israel, but even for appearing in an Instagram post with someone who was Israeli. There were students who walked to class and hear someone mutter effing Zionist under their breath, and they said in the report, I don't even know if I'm a Zionist, I'm Jewish. And so it's the report really showed this norm of Jew hatred and how deeply embedded it is, both in the student body, but perhaps more alarmingly within the faculty and curriculum.
So I want to dive into how this happened to Harvard. I grew up in Brookline, Massachusetts, which my high school was something like 40% Jewish, and tons of kids went to Harvard. And, Harvard looked a lot like my high school. So I'm not quite sure how it has become like Ramallah or Gaza City. But the first thing I want to ask you for our listeners is give us some of the examples that and that the report detailed, because I think it's important for people to hear them. This is not simply about expressing expressing hostility to Israel's war in Gaza. This is much more.
Yeah, so a number of these examples are far before October 7th. This is really about the way October 7th turned up the heat on an issue that has been on a very high simmer for decades. Since the 1920s, Harvard had Jewish quotas and very outwardly addressed the, quote, I'm using air quotes, Jewish problem. In this report, I mean, I'm just going to pull up some of the things that I covered at the School of Public Health, a 2022 course called Settler Colonial Detriments on Health required students to read material that literally argued, and I'm using quotes, Zionism manipulated Judaism as a religion to reinterpret history and redefine Jewishness in terms of ethnic belonging. There was a student at Admitted Students Day for Harvard Medical School who was just told blatantly, Zionists are not welcome at Harvard Medical School. There was, at the Divinity School, a Israeli doctoral student said the professor began the class about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict saying the discourse is saturated with the Israeli narrative and that she had decided to remove Israeli sources from the syllabus. This is a course literally on Israeli-Palestinian history, and there is not one source material that, that is an Israeli source or shows the Israeli perspective. And then, like I said, there are the social ostracization. There's an Israeli grad student who was told by one of his friends it would, quote, hurt his career to associate with the Zionists or to be publicly associated with one. There was a student who was in the IDF who said she felt scared to walk back to her dorm room. I mean, this is an extremely hostile, volatile environment for Jewish students and professors.
Well, I think the rest of the school should be afraid of a student in the IDF if they ever try to mess with her. The lionesses of the IDF are something to behold.
Yeah, that would be my advice to them. Yeah.
But we also saw this. There was this, I remember right after October 7th, there was this video that went viral of an editor of the Harvard Law Review, like physically harassing an Israeli student. And I just saw the other day that Harvard Law Review gave this student, Ibrahim Barmal, who was charged with assaulting a Jewish student that was sentenced to 80 hours of community service, with a $65,000 fellowship award to go work for CARE in Los Angeles.
Yeah. This is a perfect example. This was the instance I believe you're referring to was at a, quote, die-in protest, which is a real thing that happens at Harvard. And this Israeli student is mobbed. He's surrounded by these protesters and he's assaulted and nothing happens. The school doesn't do anything about it. And they kind of leave it to the local courts to decide. They were, their punishment, as you said, was 80 hours of community service. And to your point, there is no real punishment for behaving that way. And if anything, like you said, with this fellowship, it's actually rewarded. It's remarkable. It's really remarkable.
The argument that you're making that seems to be pretty clear is that what October 7th did was it gave a permission structure to people to more blatantly engage in the anti-Semitism that already existed all over campus. And I mean, that's actually really interesting because I think that's not something that gets underscored. People talk about this as something that is a reaction to what happened on October 7th and to its Israeli retaliation, to Israeli defense of its people and its interests. And in fact, this is just not. It was on a simmer before that. I don't know the answer to this question. Has Harvard always been a bastion of anti-Semitism?
I mean, the history there is extremely long. There were actual Jewish quotas in the 1920s. And there were guest speakers like Leonard Jeffries who had theories about the Jews' world domination. As far back as 1922, the governing board of Harvard unanimously voted there was a Jewish problem on campus. And so at that time in admissions, you're seeing something in the 1920s that a little bit resembles the kind of DEI admissions we're seeing now, which was that, okay, we want to increase diversity on Harvard's campus. What that really meant is you want less Jews, which they were open about. And so where do Jews live? They live at that time, they lived in New Jersey, in Boston, in New York. And they said, okay, well, we want to have students at Harvard from every state represented. Okay, well, if you start to have students from California and Texas and Washington and Utah, there are going to be less Jews. And so this was kind of this less overt way of saying we want more kinds of students, but they're not going to be Jewish. So there's a really, really, really long history there. Rabbi David Wolpe just wrote an incredible piece in the Free Press about his year at Harvard Divinity School as a visiting scholar. And he talks about how even before October 7th, there was just this normalization of guest speakers kind of saying the things that we just alluded to, which is that Zionism is racism, and that was just totally accepted. And then, like you said, after October 7th, all hell broke loose because there was permission to be really open about it. And then as soon as it was normalized, there was kind of no going back. The cat was out of the bag after that.
I remember when they had the lawsuit about the discrimination against Asian students and they were going through the history of admissions at Harvard and other Ivy League schools. The whole concept of holistic admissions was because when they started to allow Jews to come in and it was merit-based admissions, there were too many Jews getting in. So they came up with the concept of holistic admissions, which was code for fewer Jews, taking into account other factors other than merit. And you still see to this day the resistance to merit-based admissions because we can't shape the class in the racial or religious or whatever ways we want to shape it. So it's an ongoing problem, isn't it?
Yeah. And I mean, I've spoken recently just in my reporting to people really involved in Harvard and in their admissions. And they basically say something really reminiscent of what I was just describing in the 1920s, which is like, we want each Harvard class to represent the country. Okay. And if Jews are less than 2% of the country, of the world, then obviously there are going to be less Jews than there are going to be African Americans, and that's just how it is.
So it's going to be 50% conservative, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Going forward, right? If you wanted to represent America.
Over 50% of them will surely be Trump voters. And so it was explained to me as like, well, this is just an algorithmic truth. Like if we're representative of the country, then of course they're going to be. This was after when, I don't know if you guys saw this, there was a graph that went really viral on Twitter, X, I guess, that basically showed the decline in Jewish admissions. And it said, there is more discrimination. What it showed is there's more discrimination against Jews in the last 10 years or 20 years than there was in the 1920s when there were actual quotas. And so I kind of asked a Harvard administrator about this, and their answer to that was, well, we want to have more students from low-income families, first-generation college students. Those are not Jews. Like by and large, most Jews' parents went to college and they are not generally low income. And so that obviously results in less Jews being admitted. Now, there's kind of this conversation that Jewish excellence has kind of been in decline because we're no longer under, the kind of first generation American pressure to succeed in that way. And that the average, 18-year-old Jewish kid after World War II would score higher on an SAT than an 18-year-old Jewish kid now. And that might be true, but I don't really think it's a winning argument when we're seeing what's happening on their campus.
It's so gross. And it's just a no-win situation because there are endless ways of discriminating that they've found. And the second that you go after them for one of them, they simply find another one. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the moral equivalency problem as well, because Harvard did not simply do a report on anti-Semitism. Harvard did also a report on Islamophobia. Right? Despite the fact that, nationally speaking, almost 70% of religious-based hate crime is focused on Jews, and less than 9% is focused against Muslims. So, and I'm sure that those figures are even more exaggerated at Harvard itself. And yet Harvard did this report on Islamophobia. You talked a little bit about this in your piece as well.
Yeah, I have so many
many thoughts.
My word count for that piece did not permit all of my thoughts. I'm very happy to be talking about it now. Just to set the table, any type of religious or political discrimination or bigotry should be, stopped and condemned, of course. But to release these statements in tandem, as if these two groups have experienced the same thing over the past 2 years, let alone 100 years, is completely absurd. And I think it demonstrates how deeply Harvard is frankly in denial or unclear about their anti-Semitism problem. Even if you read their report side by side, which I'm sure only freaks like me are doing, their recommendation sections are completely at odds with each other. The anti-Semitism report suggests the IRA definition of anti-Semitism for basically behavioral proceedings. The Islamophobia report says that the IRA definition of anti-Semitism limits speech. The list kind of goes on here. The Islamophobia report mentions Jewish donors and how they influence policy, but there's not, if you command F Qatar in the anti-Semitism report, that surely does not come up. And so releasing them in tandem is the entire problem, actually. There was a quote in there that said, like, it was an introduction of the Islamophobia report that basically said, like, anti-Semitism has permeated everything so much that you can't even voice pro-Palestinian beliefs without being punished. I don't even understand how that was printed and published. If you look at what's happened on Harvard's campus in the past 2 years alone, there are Palestinian protests every single day. Kids are getting spit on for wearing kippahs, and every single person is wearing a keffiyeh. It's unbelievable. It's really unbelievable.
So you graduated from Columbia in 2021, another school that's had this.
I actually graduated. I'm technically class of 2023, but I left early to work for the Free Press, which worked out well for me.
Good for you. Tell us what your experience was on campus in a school like Columbia.
Yeah, I mean, part of the reason that I did leave early was because of what I experienced. It was not as like overt in the things that I'd read to you from this Harvard report. I wasn't spit on or told by professors my opinions weren't welcome. Well, that kind of did happen. But the reason that I emailed Barry in the first place was because I had been following her career for a long time, and I had the things she wrote about while she was at Columbia, I felt like I was bearing the fruits of all the things that she kind of saw coming around the bend. And I would be in classes, in small discussion groups even, with 15 people led by a professor, and I would voice my opinions about Israel and would be met with total backlash, really intensely, from students and professors. And then after class, the professor would say, "Can you hang back for a minute?" And I thought, oh, great, she's gonna, tell me I'm getting a worse grade or whatever. And she said, "I actually agree with you. I think this is one of the most like confused issues on campus, but like I just can't say that." This is a tenured professor at Columbia telling a freshman that they, behind closed doors, agree with them, but do not have the courage in front of a group of other 18-year-olds to, voice what they think is right, or even to moderate the conversation. And then there were pettier things. I mean, I was really outspoken about my Zionism and anti-Semitism. And so I was sent nasty things on Instagram DMs, like high school stupid stuff. I was accused of blood libel. I mean, it was crazy. And like Harvard, I will say, it was normalized. And so there were swastikas painted on dorm rooms. And I remember really being so freaked out by it because it was on a Jewish student's door. And there was one email sent out, and then nothing really happened. Like, they took off the paint. They didn't find who did it. I don't really think they tried that hard. And so that's what my few years there was like, and in part why I just was
And this
like,
is before October 7th, right?
yeah, thank God, truly, I was not there after that, because I think I would have lost my mind.
It just shows your point that all October 7th, it didn't produce this anti-Semitism. It brought it up to the surface. It allowed people who had been quietly anti-Semites or subtle anti-Semites, all of a sudden felt empowered to express their views because they saw all these other people doing it. And so they joined in and showed who they really are.
Yeah, and I think it also opened the gate for this kind of like Soviet Union kind of anti-Semitism that served two purposes. And one was to, proudly, hate Jews. But the other was to kind of destroy the root of what we know to be as Western civilization. So this serves two purposes. And it's why the same people saying, from the river to the sea are also the same people saying death to America. That is not new or surprising to me at all.
No, it's not new and it's not surprising. Although I think it was a big surprise to a lot of Jews, and a lot of people, not just Jews, that most Jews believed that never again was very serious, and that World War II had really bred anti-Semitism, not simply overt anti-Semitism, but deeply felt but hidden anti-Semitism out. And the answer is, oh my God, no, it didn't. It really didn't. And that, I think, was really horrifying to a lot of people. Now, what's been interesting, though, is the Trump administration has given new fuel to the fire. And a lot of people who otherwise resented the fact that they had to address overt acts of discrimination, legal discrimination against Jewish students, now want to talk about the quote unquote weaponization of anti-Semitism, right? And so they're going after the Trump administration for taking American colleges and universities to task and putting at risk their grant money, their federal dollars, and their status. So tell me a little bit about, I'm curious what you think about this.
Yeah, I mean, there's a New York Times piece today from, a number of
I
Jewish
saw.
groups kind of condemning the Trump administration's approach to all of this. I've been reporting on this since, end of January, and it's been really hard for me to be really upfront because I've seen firsthand how toxic these campuses are for Jewish students and how really baked into the system it is with faculty, with admissions, with curriculum. But also, I get on the phone with Columbia researchers who were actually the most outspoken against anti-Semitism on campus, who work, 60 blocks north of Columbia's undergraduate school, who can't continue to research things like ALS and cancer. And so to me, that is the tragedy in all of this, is that the professors who are teaching, gender studies, who are literally leading the protests, don't really face any punishment, but the people that are, in many cases, mostly Jewish, number one, and two, were the most outspoken, are now losing their federal funding for researching things that are obviously to the benefit of society, like curing cancer. And so in that respect, the Trump administration is leveraging what it has, which is its grants, and those grants are from the NIH and the HHS, and those are for research. And so if there were grants for Middle Eastern studies programs, I would hope that those would be the ones targeted rather than, ALS research. But those are the means the government has right now. And I mean, there was another letter from Education Secretary Linda McMahon, I think yesterday, to Harvard, basically, I don't know if you guys saw this, basically threatening their tax exempt status. So this has launched, so many debates. And I think that anyone who feels really clearly one way or another hasn't really thought about it enough, because I felt really dead set in the fact that going really hard after these schools was the only way to go. But it's heartbreaking to talk to these researchers who just want to, do their jobs and can't.
Right, but it's not on the Trump administration. It's on the schools who wish to perpetuate this culture of anti-Semitism that puts at risk their federal funding. They would, for them and for Harvard in particular, right? It's more important for them to protect their right to hate Jews and their right to have a campus that feels like Berlin in 1936, right, than it is to actually do something so aggressive against that culture that it would protect all those ALS researchers and cancer researchers. But they don't actually want to fix this, do they?
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think Columbia, at the very least came to the negotiating table. Now, the old president, President Armstrong, she has, if I can say, no moral backbone, and was saying one thing to the Trump administration and another to faculty, which I reported on because there was a transcript from a meeting where she says to faculty, "Don't worry about it, guys. I'm not doing any of this." And then, she turns around and says to McMahon and the education department, "Yep, you got it. We're on it." But they did actually agree to some of these things. If you look at Columbia's protests, the kids chaining themselves to the gates, they're literally having people cut the chains off. I wish that they were, stronger about it, but they came to the table. Harvard, on the other hand, just said no to, we're not doing any of these demands. We're not coming to the negotiating table. And actually, you're violating our First Amendment rights. And so I think you're exactly right that if they cared about preserving what the university ought to be and fixing this problem, federal grants would not have to be cut. It's obviously a really drastic measure. So, I mean, even today, Columbia sent an email to researchers that said they're cutting like 180 jobs. So they're laying off 180 people over fixing the problem they have.
I remember when the announcement came that I think first of it was Columbia, but that there was a story in the New York Times or one of the papers saying faculty outraged at administration over this. It's like they weren't outraged while the anti-Semitism was happening. They were only outraged when their grants were affected. And so I have a minimum of sympathy for a lot of these faculties because they were perfectly happy to be living in 1930s Berlin and just going about their work, even if it wasn't directly related. And where was the outrage when their campuses were being roiled by anti-Semitism? Where was the outrage when Jewish students couldn't get to their classes to study medicine and biology and all the rest of it because they were being blocked by that? It's like the only thing that the universities understand is money. And so I get that there's probably somebody toiling away to try and cure a disease somewhere who feels caught in the crossfire. But overall, the only thing that's having any impact is threatening their money.
Exactly. I mean, the last 2 years have kind of been a lesson in like, it's not your problem till it's your problem. And I think if you read any history book, Jews are always kind of the first ones to, wave their hands up and scream, hey, we have a problem here. And then, months, years, decades later, other people start to say, oh, wow, this really is a problem. And I think it's exactly the same in this scenario. My one soft spot, if I'll be totally honest, and it might be, a blind one, is that I speak to a number of these researchers at Columbia specifically, and they were the ones sending emails and, kind of leading these charges to combat anti-Semitism on campus. That is not, you're right, by and large, what was happening at most of these schools. And I've probably spoken to the small percentage of people that did take action. But it pains me that those people can't do their jobs.
That's fair.
Because of the Columbia administration, let me be clear, and yet they're gender studies teachers continuing to spew garbage and they're kind of getting out scot-free. That keeps me up at night.
Yeah, well, there's a cost for doing the wrong thing. I mean, Harvard's endowment is $53.2 billion. If they want to backfill some of the losses from the federal government, they can backfill them with their endowment, which of course they don't want to touch because that's about paying administrators as opposed to doing things for students.
Oh, the grants were paying the administrators too, Danny.
Oh,
So they were charging 69% on
were.
top of that's the Doge found out that they were charging 69% on top of the grants in order to pay for administration. Taxpayers were covering that too.
Some people, some universities were, not all
Harvard.
of them. That's right.
Harvard.
Yeah, the financial situation there is really interesting. And I'm not in any way an expert on this, but, the people I've talked to about this will say a couple of things. One is like, it's actually harder to dip into an endowment than you might think, which is that if I donate the Maya Sulkin soda fountain in the cafeteria and I endow that, that soda machine, it doesn't work that, you can say, oh, but now there's no cancer research, so we're going to use the Maya Sulkin soda fountain machine money and put that towards cancer research. They're earmarked for really specific purposes. And also, there's over $50 billion, and some of that can be put toward things like giving money to these researchers. But of course, they don't, like you said, want to dip into it in that way. They want to be sitting on top of this amount of money.
Right, of course they do. And I mean, we're a 501c3, the American Enterprise Institute. We understand very well that there's such a thing as restricted giving. I can assure you that more than 50% of Harvard's money is not restricted giving. They could use it to do the right thing. The real problem, and this is really what the Trump administration has gotten at, and I think we can all have a reasonable conversation about the kind of steps that the Trump administration has taken and the doors that they've opened and the threats that they've made. And I think there's a wide variety of views on those, and I'm hesitant about some of them as well. Nonetheless, Harvard's its adamant desire to preserve the very infrastructure of Jew hatred that they have is remarkable. Let's just put it at that.
Yeah. And even though the report is 311 pages and it's grueling, it actually doesn't show no report can demonstrate like a general vibe. You know what I mean? Like what it can't show is this baked in thing that has existed for decades that completely allows this kind of behavior. And so, yeah, you can list 1,000 incidences of horrible anti-Semitic behavior, but what no report can really demonstrate is what we all know to be true, which is that it's just a part of the culture. It's the more minute things. It's the way a student feels walking to class. It's the way a professor feels about going to a Jewish service. It's the way someone feels about inviting a certain speaker. Those are things that are not in the report, but those are what define institutions like this.
Well, just that it's interesting that you say that it's baked in because it's not just anti-Semitism. It's, as you pointed out earlier, it's anti-Americanism and it's neo-Marxism. So that's what's really baked into these universities, and this is one of the manifestations of it. If you look at the Trump administration's letter, they're not just demanding that they address the anti-Semitism, they're also demanding that they address the DEI and this whole neo-Marxist culture of everything's broken into an oppressor and oppressed class, right? Which really is deeply baked in. And it's like the old Marxism of the Soviet Union was class. Now we've got the Marxism of race, but it's all the same ideology of oppressor versus oppressed. And so that's where the anti-Semitism is allowed to manifest because the Israelis are the oppressor class and the oppressed can do whatever they want to fight the oppressor. It's one manifestation of a deeper cancer in the institution. Until you address that, you're not going to solve it.
Exactly. And it's like I said, in this kind of thinking, it's always historically the Jews that come first in this kind of anti-Western logic. And so that is not new at Harvard. That's been true forever. And so it will not be long until other people who in this moment are saying, okay, the Jews are being hysterical. This is really not so crazy. As I've seen people say on Twitter after the report, like, oh, boo-hoo, these kids are getting bullied. Like, we were all bullied. It's fine. There will come a time when this actually is at their doorstep. And by that point, by the time everyone realizes it, it very well could be too late.
Right. The only other last thing, and this is my exit question, that I want to talk about is the parties outside that are helping to pay for this. Because what the first Trump administration found when the Education Department dug into it was that most of these schools are non-compliant with the Higher Education Act requirement to divulge grants of more than $250,000 from foreign countries. Now, we've known for a long time that a lot of these elite universities are taking money from the People's Republic of China, and that those are paying for things like Confucius societies and things like that. But in addition, the government of Qatar is providing money that is furthering the radicalization of Middle East studies departments. Did you get any bead on that element of what's going on at Harvard?
Yeah, I reported on this a couple of weeks ago with my colleague Franny. And since the government has started collecting this data in the 1980s, Harvard has been the top recipient of foreign funding of any school by a lot. The second is Cornell, and pretty much most Ivies are on the list of those top 10 schools. Harvard also, as you said, did not disclose, which is Section 117, did not properly disclose the amount of foreign funding that they were receiving, which is why there was this investigation into what was going on there. But that's why when this report came out, I was so stunned, and maybe I shouldn't have been, that Qatar or China is not mentioned once. And in the Islamophobia report, which as their release timing indicates you should read them at the same time, talks about Jewish donors. These foreign governments whose interests are at direct odds with the United States are funneling money into these universities. And then we're kind of left thinking, wow, how did these places get so anti-Semitic and anti-American? And it's like, well, China and Qatar are giving them money and their declared interests are against ours. And they're at our top universities. Top is in air quotes, of course.
Well, you've done an amazing job reporting on this, and you're a rising star at the Free Press, and we are so thrilled that you agreed to come onto our podcast. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. I'm really honored, and I'm a fan of you guys, so thank you.
Oh,
Thank you, Maya.
Well, Danny, that's depressing.
Yeah, it is. It's very depressing. And I'll tell you something else. I really think we need to double down on this foreign funding of perverse, malign ideas at American universities and in the American press and elsewhere. I realize that for those of us who care deeply about anti-Semitism, we focus a lot on the government of Qatar because it is probably, on anti-Semitism, the single greatest engine of that behavior on American campuses and elsewhere. And it's becoming more and more pervasive as the Qataris spend more and more money at a variety of universities. But do not think to yourself, oh, Danny just cares about the Jews and that's why it's Qatar, because these laws also protect us from the malign influence of the People's Republic of China. And if we think that the Qataris, a tiny island nation with a lot of money, are bad, let me assure you that the 1.4 billion people of China and the Chinese Communist Party are a far bigger challenge. We need, and I don't mean to sound all, Dr. Strangelovey here, but we need to be vigilant because they are after our freedom. They are after our tolerance of different races and religions. They are after everything that America stands for.
Amen. It's not just about anti-Semitism, about anti-Americanism, which is a deep root. I would just say the other thing is, God bless the Trump administration for what they're doing. They have frozen $11 billion in funding in at least 7 universities so far. And by the way, that's a fraction of the funding. Like, I think Harvard gets like $9 billion a year and we've frozen 2.2. So it's not like we've frozen everything that's going. We're just sort of taking some money to let them know we're serious. And they've sent letters to 60 universities telling them that they could be next if they don't address these problems. I think the only thing these schools understand is money. The irony is that that's what they say about the Jews, but it's becoming, it's in fact, it's what's true of Harvard. It's what's true of Columbia. It's what's true of all these schools. All they care about is money, Danny.
No. They care about money and they care about protecting the infrastructure of discrimination against Jews. They want to keep their gender studies department and their Qatar-funded Middle East studies department. And to them, that is more important than the medical research that they're doing. And that's even grosser. So there, Harvard.
There you go. Well, and if you want if you want the government to have nothing to say about it, then be like Hillsdale. Don't take any federal money. Even then, you can't violate federal discrimination laws. So you still have to comply with federal law. So clean yourself up, Harvard.
Absolutely. Amen to that. Hey, take care, everybody.
We'll see you next week. Let us know what topics you'd like us to cover. You can get in touch with the show by emailing us at whatthehell@aei.org.
Or you can reach us on Twitter. I'm at @dpletka.
And I'm at Mark Thiessen. That's Mark with a C.
Please rate and review the podcast. If you like the show, please subscribe, share it, comment on Apple Podcasts, or wherever you're listening to this.
Thanks for listening.